intend to do here. I would say, and let me know, Jason, if you have anything to say with regard to this as far as direction is concerned. Excuse me. Let's allow Jason to do the presentation, and then we'll field for questions and answers at that point in time. And I will act as a go-between on that portion of the program. Does that sound good?
Yeah, I think that works. If I'm being unclear, just wave at John. John, break in, because I'm okay being interrupted. This is your time. If I'm not being clear, it's probably better to stop me and make sure we're all walking together.
Okay, that sounds good, Jason.
All right. So you can see my screen at this point, correct?
Yes, we can see your screen and everything looks really good.
Okay, well, good. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for being there. John, thank you for everything you're doing with the Woodland Stewards program. Lori, thank you for manning the ship and keeping a hand on the rudder whenever people are running all about. This is a great organization. I'm happy to be here. Let's see if my slide advance works. It does. So I am Jason Grabosky. I work at Rutgers University within the urban forestry program. Basically, I do a lot with tree biology as far as my research. My teaching is general forestry and urban forestry. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about water. Before we get started, I'm just going to point out that I do work for your land grant institution. We accept federal funds. And as part of that, the federal government wants us, people who use federal funds for research, to put up this slide and to point your attention to the bottom link. We are supposed to be an open workplace. We're supposed to be equal opportunity. If you think that we're not living up to that ideal, please contact either Rutgers Cooperative Extension. You see an 848-932-3584 phone number there. You can also see the U.S. government link. We cannot improve if people aren't telling us where we're falling down. So if there is something that we can do, please let us know. That's the only way people can improve. Now, to the talk, this is the Woodland Stewards program. And so you probably know this intuitively, but trees take time. And because of that, when we talk about forest stewardship, we often play a long game, and we don't look at next year. We might look 5 years out, but we're looking at a long time span to play out any kind of a management plan or any kind of a goal for values of the community that is of ownership or tending this particular landscape. The problem is a lot of folks, they only notice things when they start going off kilter. When they call for advice, they want to know how to fix something and fix it fast. And you can see that there's a difference in that kind of a timeline. Whether it's an immediate fix or whether we're talking about moving a community structure over decades. And because of that, we look at programs like the Woodland Stewards, like the Environmental Stewards program, even the Master Gardeners program, as well as things like scouting. And there are a lot of different programs out there. And we look to provide that linkage between the long view and that more transactional, hey, I'm seeing this, what do we do today? This is one of those important programs because you're a linkage to your community to look at that longer view. And when we look at those longer views, we identify the values of the community, and then we try to translate those values into achievable management directives as informed by ecology, by soil science, by tree biology. And that's what forestry is. Forestry is the art and science of managing these large landscape assemblages all the way down to sometimes even individual trees. but it's informed by the dispassionate informants of ecology, soil science, hydrology, meteorology. So in New Jersey, where we have the forested lands, you know, they're going to be predominantly in the oak hickory groups or in the pine groups. It depends where you are in the state. And in the broadest of terms, if we left everything alone, if there's enough water in the system, that landscape moves towards a forested community. And when we say that, it's not trees wall to wall, it's trees where trees are going to work and compete well, but there's going to be disturbances. So there's always this mosaic that is moving towards a forested condition when we have enough water and where the soils are rich enough to deal with that. The point is that on the grand scale, this is stable, you know, across the entire state, across the mid-Atlantic, across the Northeast. It's pretty stable, but in the local condition, things are always changing. It's a very dynamic system, and it's a system that's linked to your surrounding environment. But the grand driver here is light. Light is your best growth enhancer, but that growth is mediated by water. And so today we're talking a bit about carbon because carbon seems to be sexy, but water is probably the more important currency or monetization because dead trees don't sequester carbon. And not only do trees need water and forests need water, but the humans that are imposing themselves on these systems, we need water too. So when we look at forestry as that art and science of creating and managing forest assemblages, it's to meet certain goals, it's to meet needs, it's to meet values. And right now we're hearing a lot about carbon as being one of those needs and one of those goals. Silviculture, as opposed to forestry, silviculture is looking at the trees themselves. And so today, while we're forest stewards, woodland stewards, we're going to be talking a little bit about silviculture as far as drilling down to the individual trees and then how that moves the system. Now, I bring this slide up because we've heard that because we say that forestry is an art and a science, that really it's not science at all, that forestry is just about cutting trees. That's good spin doctoring, but I point out that the Medical Association also talks about themselves, the medical societies talk about the art and science of medicine. The science is what we use to inform our practice. The art is taking the practice and deploying it site by site, situation by situation, and trying to read and understand what the person, what the patient, whether that is in a medical sense or what the landscape in the forestry sense, how do we apply our science? How do we apply our knowledge in a way that does the most good and does no harm? That's what we're after. And in an imperfect world, sometimes we make mistakes, but more often than not, we learn and we improve the science. We've improved medicine, we've improved forestry. Most importantly in forestry, we had this huge movement in the 70s, broadly speaking, the 1970s, moving from an extractive approach to a services approach. And so when we are in some of the debates, let's realize that when we say the art and science, that's not a bad thing. Now, right now, carbon is that big value, and we have grants coming out now. You may have noticed that the big infrastructure package that the federal government passed, there's between $800 and $900 million in building capacity for forestry in those federal grants. And then in the Inflation Reduction Act, there's $1.3 billion specifically to urban and community forestry. And those are going to go out as grants. And then we have RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is right now in New Jersey putting out grants to grab carbon. And we look at afforestation, putting trees in areas that previously were not forest or lawn agriculture periods. Reforestation where we haven't, yes. Did I hear a question?
No, excuse me, it was a cough.
Oh, okay, no problem. I just want to be respectful to you folks. Reforestation is where you have a disturbance. It was a forest and you're repatriating that forest, whether that's through a natural regeneration or whether that's artificially by planting stuff in that space. There's ingrowth. That's, you can see the slide, you can read faster than I can speak. We talk about biomass growth within a forest from existing trees, that's accretion. And then we look at strategies, and woodland stewards, we look at strategies as far as avoiding conversion from forest to something else, unless there is a higher value in that change, higher value to the environment and to the well-being of the community, not a higher value to a real estate or a monetary transaction. And then there's also avoided emissions as far as being strategic and where we allow trees so that we can work with the environment in our design. And then, of course, there's this thing called proforestation, which is a strategy that feeds into all of those things on the left, where we're trying to get a net gain of carbon based on a presumption that that plant community and that structure is poised to increase its ability to capture carbon if we just let it alone. And then that hands-off approach would be preferable to some other strategy, but it's only one strategy out of many. Now, carbon is important. You know, when we think about carbon, it has always been important. When we were in extraction forestry, we were looking for growth so we could get timber, or we could get things that we took out of the forest. That's extraction. And of course, you have to grow it first. So carbon gain has always been part of the forest management system. It's just that the value that we apply to it has changed, one from extracting out as a material to one of a service as far as trapping it. So, you know, things have changed, but they haven't changed that much as far as our understanding of how forests work and how we can manage for that kind of growth. But the fact is, there are other values to consider. It's not just one thing. It's a large dynamic system. It provides habitat for other organisms. It also has an aesthetic standpoint. And right now we see a lot of arguments with local landowners about the aesthetics of doing management. We also talk about passive recreation or active trail recreation. But all of these different things are not mutually exclusive. You know, you can walk and chew bubble gum at the same time. A forest can be providing habitat while growing for carbon gain, while functioning as a filter for cleaner water provision, all at the same time. As goes water, so goes your society. And as a society, we're having this conversation. We probably ought to think about the water because dead trees do not sequester carbon. And you need that water. We learned that at the lost city of Petra, which was an engineering marvel of moving water through an arid environment to create a city as a stop along a popular trade route. And when the dam broke on the reservoir and flooded things out, they just abandoned that city. And when we look at the upper right on your screen, I'm hoping you see some ruins. Those were the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, where we controlled water, we controlled containerized production of plant material, and we had a city with an incredible amount of vegetation in the middle of an otherwise arid environment. We can come to someplace more like the Northeast US. Here is upstate New York. This is out by Canandaigua, Rochester area, and the Ganondagan settlement, where they used hollowed tree stems as water piping to move water from more dangerous zones within the walls of their community, and they had running water before European settlement. Okay, As goes water, so goes your society. If we understand and can manage water, not only does it fit our society, but it also helps us control the success or failure of the landscape for the management of what we need out of our landscape, whether that's habitat ecology or whether that's the raw materials to build our homes or whether it's for growing food to keep ourselves alive. So where are we right now? We have climate change, we have population issues, we have migration from coasts inward with sea level rise. Carbon is useful, but it's probably not the most important currency to discuss because people need drinking water. We use water in forests for photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is taking light and using light as the energy source. We take carbon dioxide and water and turn it into a sugar. We also efflux some oxygen, and we're big fans of oxygen around here. That's what we're using for respiration. But we need water for that photosynthesis to capture and transfer radiant energy from the sun into chemical energy that drives our entire environment. We also use water in transpiration because there's more sunlight hitting us than we can deal with. Instead of leaves cooking on the trees, it's going to take a lot of water from a liquid form in the tree, turn it to a gaseous form, and efflux it out the leaf. We call that transpiration. So the leaf uses water for a coolant of that engine of photosynthesis. So we use a lot of water in a forest. That's why if you have enough water, you get forests. If there's not enough water, you're not going to get a forest. Forests can be managed for water storage, for water banking, and for cleaning water. And that becomes a really important management consideration. When we do that, we start looking at forests and plants as far as how much water goes in for how much carbon gets locked in, and then how much water comes out for how much carbon gets locked in. So water and access to water governs the tree. Light is your best growth enhancer. Water governs the productivity of the system. And trees use a lot of water. Here you've got a tree, yes. Oh, that was a cough, I'm sorry. Quercus bicolor, this is a moderately sized tree in New York City that I've been watching since 1997. This is about 22 years after it's been transplanted. And when we look at this tree captured over 2,700 liters of water in that year of observation, but it's over 29,000 liters of water since it was transplanted. And we can model that in programs like iTree. iTree Eco is the ecological modeling tool that we can use in forest plots to talk about what are the environmental services we have. So, we use models to project these things. Okay, this tree takes a lot of water, and I'm going to, let's see here. Can you see my cursor at this point?
Yes.
Okay, so look at this number. I get 0.0002 carbon per 1 water. We're using a lot more water than we are carbon. If we're planting trees for carbon, like we are for Reggie, we really ought to be thoughtful about where we're putting trees for carbon, because you need access to a lot of water, else you're not going to get the carbon that you're modeling. As a matter of fact, this tree, if we think about this tree, think about the water involved here. That's like 2 swimming pools, 25 by 45, well, a swimming pool, 25 by 45 foot long and 4.5 foot deep. Otherwise stated, it's a couple tractor trailer loads of water. It's a lot of water for one tree. And on this site, there's 75 street trees on the block about this size. All right, 1 block, trees on either side. There's 75 per block, and each one of them represents 2 tractor trailer loads of water. It's a lot of water. So when we plant for carbon, we've got a provision for water, Or what's going to happen is we're going to disrupt the water tables by over extracting water if all the trees that we plant actually grow. And we actually have data like that in the Southeast US, where they put in thick pine plantations and they saw a change in hydrology. It's not good, it's not bad, it just is. And if we're going to purposefully plant trees for climate, for climate reasons, for carbon locking, we have to make sure we have enough water to do it, or people are going to start going thirsty, which would be ridiculous since we actually have a net increase of water coming into the New Jersey system over the next 50 years. It's just that we're going to see a lot more of it in the wintertime when we're in the leaf off condition. So we have to grab that water, stage that water so it can be deployed in the summer where we're going to have hotter temperatures and we're going to have more intermittent rainfall events of higher intensity, but they'll be marked by short stage droughts. We're already seeing that happen. So we have to get wise about the water as we're doing the carbon, not instead of doing the carbon. So when we do that, we have these models. How much soil do we need in order to grow a tree? And we have these things. And basically for a landscape, and I know this is forestry, but in a landscape, we look at 2 cubic feet of soil for every square foot of canopy. So if you draw your tree, you draw the drip line and you figure out the area under the drip line of your tree, you're going to need about 2 cubic foot per square foot for a deciduous tree. We have no really good numbers for evergreens. Just saying. But that's all assuming the longest period of time in the summer between rainfall events is 10 days. As that number changes, that volume will change. And I'm here to tell you that number is changing and it's expanding. We don't know by how much, but it might go up as far as 12 days between rainfall events on average. That's a 20% increase in how much soil you need. Now extrapolate that over an entire forest. That has profound effects as to what species will compete well over time. So when we do afforestation, when we do reforestation, when we think about this, we ought to be thinking about the environment of 2070, 2075, and what trees deal with those light drought pulses. It's probably where we should be looking, not for species specifically, we will look at species, but even red maple or sweet gum or liriodendron, the tulip tree. They have trees growing down in Georgia, in South Carolina. Maybe the provenance of our nursery stock needs to change, even if the species stays stable.
Question?
Yes.
The East Coast is getting more rain now, at least in the Northeast, over the last, couple of decades. I mean, now it's like up by almost 10%, I believe.
Okay, can you get closer to the mic a little bit?
I'm just saying that the amount of water rainfall has increased about, 4 inches or so in the Northeast over the last 10, 20 years. So
yes.
Change has caused more precipitation, at least in the Northeast.
Yeah, there is more moisture coming, but when is it coming? How is it coming? Because the tree isn't, the forest is using water at a pretty governed rate. What we're seeing is that there's the net volume, but there's also a periodicity. There's also a patchiness. We witnessed all sorts of drought conditions, going across the Adirondack Mountain Preserve and jumping over towards the Green Mountains. And, right now, we're seeing the lake effect patterns where there's certain parts around the Great Lakes that are getting dumped with immense amounts of snow, yet 40, 50, upwards of 100 miles away, where I'm sitting right now, they are 40 inches of snow behind their normal. So we will get that water, but how are we getting the water? When are we getting the water? You know, the good news is we have the water. The question is, how are we managing that water so that the provisioning is stable, because the trees are on a rather stable, regular clock. Beyond that, you can have lots and lots of little trees, which is what we're going to have when we do afforestation or when we allow a reforestation to occur. We get lots of little things which are taking that resource that's available. But as the trees get older and older, you can't start with 1,000 trees in year 1 and have 1,000 trees at year 100. You may have 10 or 12 trees because the soil only holds so much. And it's not just the water, it's mineral nutrition turnover. It's decomposition over your organic layer, as long as you don't have crazy worms milling through and disrupting your nutrient turnover in the organic layer. So there's a carrying capacity to the site. And when we do something like a Reggie grant or some of these tree planting grants that are coming towards us, it's not just about the planting, it's about the tending and the ability to say, yes, I'm planting 5,000 trees, but I'm only expecting 50 to 100 of them 50 years from now. Or you're going to make up that number. But then it's being selective and enabling the strong ones while thinning out some of those weaker ones, just like you would in any kind of a garden or horticulture sense, only it's on a much larger scale. So when John was talking about tending is that human intercession to make sure that all of these little things aren't competing with themselves and holding the whole system back as far as its ability to move carbon, to move water, or to provide habitat. And realize that, there's only a certain amount that the ground can hold. And if humans are not doing that intercession or tending, nature is going to do it anyhow. It's just we have to be ready for the consequences not to fit our human convention. So forestry is just replicating what might be happening in nature, but it's in a more controlled way. It's kind of like when I look at a tree in an urban environment, gravity always wins. When a tree falls, it can fall in a fast, uncontrolled manner around cars and people and structures, or we can come in and we can take it down in a controlled manner to minimize unintended consequences for that failure. Tending your woodlands is really about us gently directing what's going to happen anyhow, so that we're moving towards a preferred situation. Letting it go is almost like condemnation by neglect, because if you're saying no management, well, then invasive species are in there. What do you do when you remove invasive species? That's attending. So management is about directing systems. Trees last a long time. This is a grove of Norway spruce up in central New York. And all you need is one good wind on this 90-year-old plantation, and you see trees start falling over. Because you always have wind, you always have lightning, you always have periodic droughts, you always have periodic floods, you always have diseases and pests. So we know that there's a natural transition in the forest, and part of that transition can be managed by looking at stocking density. And here we have a really old stand, and you can see in this picture here, really, really thin soils. And so it doesn't take a lot for one tree to go. And then when one tree goes in this situation, many trees start going because you've changed the wind patterning within the stand. and then it just starts, building itself out. When we shut off the water, we can see negative impacts from leaf scorch. Here we have leaf scorch on oak and leaf scorch on maple. The leaf scorch on oak in this case is due to a bacterium inside the vessels. The water flow of the tree is interrupted. Whereas on the right, you have a red maple. This is due to road salt damage. And this is more about an abiotic chemical issue rather than a biotic bacterial issue. Same symptom. And it's because what you're doing is you're effectively shutting the water off by influencing the demand of water in the maple or influencing the flow of water in the oak. And so here we have our climate report. I suggest you look at this. It's a really nifty document. I just do 2020 New Jersey Scientific Report on Climate Change. Comes right up as a PDF. And we've already kind of talked about it. It's about the water is increasing, but it's the intensity and the frequency that is going to become a problem. And we're predicting that droughts will occur more frequently than expected. And floods are going to happen more frequently than expected. And so again, I think that when we're talking about forests, we ought to also be talking about water and provisioning of that water. Whether that's coming as ice, whether that's coming as rain, it's not going to come so much as snow anymore. But we will get ice. So we do have to think about that. Okay, water supplies will be stressed from an increase in the growing season length and by extreme temperatures in the summer. This is coming out of your state climate change report. We know that in our built communities, the combined storm sewers are a real issue. And we also have to worry about groundwater quality and surface water quality because we're going to have more runoff. That's really important. That's where forestry can come in. We've been doing this since the 1890s. And here is a nice, I think this is a 1903 text. It's the Primer of Forestry by this weird guy named Gifford Pinchot. And he was German trained forester, but the first thing he talks about, page 8 in the Primer of Forestry, the uses of a forest, it's for protection and protection of water. Because people need water. Water can convey energy. Water sustains us. We're a bunch of salty water bags walking around, if you want to describe the human body in the basest of terms. We use a lot of water. So when we think about water, we think about our rivers. When we think about our rivers and streams, one thing that we ought to be thinking about within the state of New Jersey is it's getting warmer. It's looking a lot more like a Georgia environment with Piedmont soils and sandy outwash plains. It's looking kind of like parts of Florida with sandy soils with outwash plains. We ought to look at bottomland hardwood regeneration for a lot of the areas that we're managing around the canal systems, around our rivers. And if you look at the species that are there, a lot of them are already in New Jersey. The question is, are we managing that southeast bottomland? And we've worked out the silviculture, we've worked out the planning. This guide to bottomland hardwoods is an old document, I believe from 1976, but it's all written out for us. It helps us with our planning because places that have looked like what we're going to look like, we've been doing this for a long time. There are things that we can look at, and you can see on the bottom, table 6.2, there are different types, and then those types stage from early succession to late succession. So here's where we can get planning if we're dealing with water. And we deal with water. Here is New York City's water supply system. A reservoir. This is Downsville. Here's Grahamsville. Here's another one up in here. All of these reservoirs are managed for water going to New York City. And notice that these are wilderness areas with no development. We're managing these forests for the provision of watersheds, for the provision of water. That's why some people have looked at forest management and woodland stewardship as water farming, because this is the best land type that we happen to have in this region for capturing, storing, and deploying water. Now, we have those forests, but we are going to be talking about tending. And that means that you're taking stuff out of the woods, or you're dropping it and leaving it there to degrade. So that's up to you. Where does that harvested wood go? That plays heavily into your carbon budget. Whether you're taking it and locking it in as particle board or furniture or flooring or fletched in small wood products, or are you letting it rot on the ground, or are you using it for firewood, or are you grinding it as a biofuel? There's a lot of different ways we can look at where that harvested wood goes. But whenever we take stuff out of the woods, what's the response? It's going to be growth. More often than not, it's going to be growth. It's growth from the residual trees that you leave behind, that's accretion. It's growth if you take out enough and enough sunlight hits the bottom of the landscape and hits the ground, you're going to get growth from below. And if you take out larger trees, you may find that the roots stub sprout and you get coppicing or low forest regeneration. You could get growth from an entirely new population of trees, whether they blow in from the sides, whether they regenerate from the existing seed that's on the ground, or whether you physically replant. But what happens when you take stuff out of the forest? Something is going to grow back because nature hates that void. If there is growth, there is sequestration of carbon. If there's growth, there's going to be storage of carbon. One of the biggest questions is how much is cute, but over what time period? What is your time scale for success? And so we typically are talking 2050, 2070. We could be talking about 2072 for a 50-year time target, but you have to tell somebody not just what's going to happen this year, but what is your plan over time? And I mention this because New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection Forestry Division has an analytics group that's building vegetation simulations for optimization of carbon over those kinds of timescales. They're trying to build the tools so landowners and forest consultants can make plans and see how things grow out over time, accommodating for water, accommodating for risk from novel pests, and accommodating for a change in the environment. That's what they're working on behind the scenes in the offices, and they're making some substantial headway on that to the point where they're talking with the federal agencies. New Jersey forestry folks are leading this charge. And I think that's something we ought to shout about. They're doing some really good work. So this is an ugly graph by a kid named, he's darn near 40, I suppose, Bernie Isaacson, who just did a doctoral dissertation. And this is pitch pine. And what he's doing is he's looking at the mean diameter of the trees here. So 4-inch mean diameter, 6-inch mean diameter, 8-inch mean diameter. How many trees per acre? And again, we're getting to carrying capacity here. And so you notice that as all of these lines here, as you get bigger trees, you get fewer trees. Everything is moving up and to the left. There's a lot going on here. The blue lines are change in evapotranspiration as far as how much water is being lost out of the system. We have something called crowning index. This is a fire indicator for us in this case. And we have some general stocking density guides here. I'm not going to describe the whole thing, but the point is we can use this and read this, and we can find out that, if we thin the stand and move the crowning index height from 40, which is here, to 60, we lower our fire risk. We actually lower our southern pine beetle infestation risk. And we're saving about as much water in the pinelands as what we use for agriculture across the entire state. And if we're worried about water recharge in the aquifer, it's not as much about development, it's about the fact that we've got an overstocked forest. And we can influence that. And we can influence it not just for carbon, not just for water, but for fire and for insect. And I say not just for carbon, because if I take trees here and I do a thinning, they naturally are growing right back up onto the same curve over 10, 15 years. So what we're doing is we're providing growing space and then allowing infill. And we can do that at a level that does not increase ground growth if we choose, but if we want to, we can actually be more aggressive, really thin it out, and start a new regeneration pattern from the ground up instead of from the existing in. But that's silviculture, looking at relationships and building these kinds of relationships and then choosing how far do you go as far as your management and what are those consequences. And using data like this, they're putting it into models with dashboards so that consultants can drive this data and woodlot owners can make decisions, not just about one thing, but about multiple things at once. Carbon is only one consideration. It's the one that has money right now, but it's a dynamic system and it's a multifaceted system. Whenever we deal with land management, the values of the owner or the community have to accrue in a way that make it worth the time and cost. There's sustainability in an ecological sense. There's sustainability in a financial monetary sense. And there's sustainability in a social sense. And what are our tolerances as a community? I would consider that willingness to pay taxes for environmental good. But we can't tell landowners that for a public good, they have to do certain things if it's going to cause those people to lose the value at a level that they can't keep the land. They'll sell the land for development. And wouldn't you? So when we think about forestry and woodland stewardship, we have to be thinking about how do we pay for this? And how do we accrue value? Value may not be dollars and cents. We're paying for it in recreation value. We're paying for having a better songbird diversity. But we have to make sure that the values coming out are worth the costs going in. And the mission that we have as stewards is talking with our neighbors and advocating towards preferred actions with those ecological underpinnings. So going back to the original premise here that hasn't been stated formally yet, as goes the soil and as goes the water, so goes your plant community. As goes that plant community, so goes your animal community. We've talked about light being your best growth enhancer. Water modulates the productivity once you have enough light. And productivity is framed by the soils and framed by topography and framed by what society is going to allow you to do with that land. Okay, water matters. And water stress is a predicate for many of our forest pests. If a plant is stressed, it's more likely to get attacked by an insect, southern pine beetle being your best example. When we had a drought in the southeast US, that's when southern pine beetle absolutely exploded to a point that the state of Florida formally declared war on an insect to release dollars to fight the insect because as their forests were dying, so too was their fire threat rising. So it's something to think about. You need that. You need to be thinking about water, even if you're planting for carbon. We've already seen this slide about afforestation, reforestation, ingrowth. Carbon is that popular thing, and we couch it within the production of that forest. And within the production of that forest, we have ways of managing for it. But currently, we have people who are very well-intended and very passionate saying that we don't want forest management, we just want carbon. And it's based largely on this paper from Mumal, which is it's a perspectives paper. It's not a data paper. It's looking at a lot of things, thinking about it, and writing a letter, in this case, to Frontiers of Forests and Global Change in the tropical forest section, I might add. And the idea is that proforestation serves the greatest good. And it's an interesting paper. It's a thoughtful paper. And it reminds me of a different opinion piece that came out in the New York Times, which you see up there, to save the planet, don't plant trees. And that came out when the United Nations Climate Summit was being held in New York City. And this thing came out, and it hit like a dose of salts, folks. People were really up in arms. This op-ed got cited all over the place. And I see the same thing happening. Unger's paper, I find to be problematic as an opinion piece, but her research that came up with this was solid. It was really good. But the idea here is that there's a solid scientific basis that's being twisted to argue a point. And in doing so, it oversteps itself into a policy debate. And that's why you want to get to research articles where there's a different level of peer review, to make sure that somebody with no dog in the fight looks at it and says, you know, this is what you can do, or maybe this is right, maybe this is wrong, but there's a review process. And in this paper, she's an atmospheric chemist, and she's making an argument in this letter to Nature. I mean, the journal Nature is huge. Nature Climate Change, she makes an argument that, you know what, when we look at atmospheric chemistry, when we think about climate change and global modeling, we need to have atmospheric chemistry put into our climate change models. That's the premise of her Nature Climate Change document. And if you look at the data on the lower right, this op-ed is based on the fact that she's saying basically that here's our carbon and here's our atmospheric chemistry. Notice that the atmospheric chemistry can be towards warming, but it can also be towards cooling. It's above and below zero. Okay, and if we look at chemical pollutants, if we can look at, let's see, here's chemical pollutants. Here's surface albedo. This is the reflectance of sunlight off of the ground. Now, this is done in a tropical forest where there doesn't tend to be snow. So the thing is, applying something like this to the Northeast US where we have snow, there's problems extrapolating this data to make an argument about why we need to have a piece in a model, translating all the way to a statement like this, which is targeted towards tropical forests, but was picked up and used for temperate forests. You're just getting ahead of your skis. And when that op-ed came out, you know, the whole place went hair on fire, and lots of documents were written tearing apart the op-ed. And it comes down to the fact that there were 4 mistakes made in the op-ed. One is that that having a process needing consideration is not the same as having results of that modeling, which we did not have. Proforestation is a good argument, but we lack the data to say it actually works in the mid-Atlantic or up in the Northeast US. There's an overstatement saying that the statement in the op-ed said cutting trees changes the albedo from dark green to lighter gray infrastructure. So obviously it should cool off the environment, which we know the opposite happens in urban heat island effect. And also when we look at the figure, it shows that it either heats up or it cools down. You can't even say with any authority that it actually cools down. And there's hidden variables in that, such as evapotranspiration, such as water. You can't talk about carbon without talking about water. And as water leaves, goes in the atmosphere, that reflects sunlight, and you get these things called clouds too. So there's hidden variables that aren't discussed in an op-ed or in a perspectives piece. When we get to proforestation, they're saying we should, the crux of the argument is do not touch the forests because we need the old forests to be the most diverse and capture the most carbon. There's a couple problems with that. Number one, we don't necessarily have old forests in New Jersey. So we can't manage an old forest until we have an old forest. And we shouldn't be managing as an old forest if we have a young forest. It doesn't work that way. So one of the big things, a lot of people have been talking about this as far as forestry in New Jersey, and Vin Lang, who's a great consultant in the state of New Jersey, made a point to folks, all forests are not created equal across the state of New Jersey. So one management solution probably is not going to work. And when we look at our threatened and endangered species, many of them are forest floor species that require high light, which you're not getting in that older forest. You're getting in the gaps. You're getting in the interruptions, because remember, a forest is a very large geographic thing, and it's stable on the big scale, but it's very dynamic on the small scale. We need interruptions in that pattern so light gets to the ground, so these different species can exist in their cycle within the natural turnover of the forest. There's also in New Jersey this assumption of a pristine wild forest baseline. We can look no further than the Sparta Mountain debate, which used to be a minefield for the Edison complex. It's not even 150 years old in many cases. It's not an old forest. Proforestation is only considering forest and carbon dynamics as far as papers and supports, only if it agrees with the paper. It doesn't really deal with some of the bigger issues, such as insects and pests taking out old trees. Let's think about things like the old chestnut forest. We used to have a chestnut forest until chestnut blight took out the chestnut forest, and we had a white oak forest for a while, until, I guess we're calling it spongy moth now, used to be called gypsy moth, but spongy moth took out a lot of our white oak forests and they became red oak forests. The thing is that if you lock everything towards an old trajectory, you have fewer, larger trees, and that's the premise of proforestation, is that really big trees tend to lock up a lot of carbon. But really big trees tend to be old, which means they're closer to dying than younger trees. So again, you don't touch it, the forest is still going to turn over. Just like gravity always wins. The question is, are we doing it in a way where we can lock in that carbon in other ways, or are we just letting it cycle on site? And I think that we, as stewards, we ought to be thinking very carefully about how we look at this conversation. Because carbon is cool, but water's the governor. And dead trees don't sequester carbon. And with temperature changes and water changes, we're going to see forest dynamics change. We can manage towards that. And carbon and water are not mutually exclusive, but water probably is the more salient point, because if you understand water, you understand the success and failure of that system. So to finish up, carbon's not the only thing. Big trees represent big storage, but they also carry a big risk because a single dead tree takes out a lot of carbon just as fast. The trees in the forest communities provide habitats, and not all things grow in old forests. We have young forest species that occupy. And most of our threatened and endangered are higher light organisms on the forest floor. We need to be breaking patches in if we're conserving those species while considering the other bigger species. It's a spider's web. How many of us have pulled on a spider's web only to see the web warp? If we just look at carbon, we're pulling one tendril of that spider web, but all of the other services, all of the other organisms, the soil, it's all connected in that. And when you pull to look at carbon, you warp the entire system. So the idea is to pull it, look at carbon, but then please, as a steward, release it, put it back, and realize carbon's place with all of the other things in that web. I suggest it's about water. I hope you see the value in that argument and realize that we can do both. And in doing both, we probably are better stewards because we're looking at the bigger system, not just the cash at the end of the regional greenhouse gas initiative. With that, how about some questions?
I got a question. New Jersey seems to be being pushed into a lot of residential units lately, like condos / percentage going to lower income. And it just seems like we have one government agency that's a little bit out of control without any response from the public, voters or anything. And it just seems like we have an awful lot of building going on in every single township, and we're losing a lot of surface acres to parking lots, and I call it people warehousing and Amazon warehousing. But what's your thoughts on that?
Okay, it was kind of hard to hear you, but I'm going to let me rephrase and see if I capture it. You're saying that there's a lot of development, and with development, there's sealed surfaces. So how do we manage for that? Is that correct?
Well, our state, or what is it, the COA?
We get the COA to
Housing.
Yeah.
So glad you bringing this up, because I was going to actually ask like the exact same question. Because I feel like a lot of development is taking place along rivers.
Yeah, you've got to get closer because I'm not able to hear you unless you get a little bit closer. I'm sorry.
All right, I just take notice, like on my street, we just, I live in Warren Township, Somerset County. They're building 335 units. 4 stories tall, parking garages, and it was vacant land. It was an abandoned farm, from 50 years ago. But I'm just giving that as one example. Yeah. But it seems to me like there's a division of New Jersey's government, or COA, or whatever it is. It seems a little bit really pushing a lot of housing units.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of housing, 3-4 story, units. And I just think we're going to be putting a lot more people into New Jersey.
Yeah.
People warehousing. But it's just wondering if your thoughts, obviously I guess maybe Rutgers is part of the planning process. Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, okay. So Rutgers is an informant, but they really don't have a voice in planning that I've ever seen. We do have the incredible ability to say uncomfortable things and to be voted off the island when it comes to the actual planning. But with that said, development and environmental fitness are not mutually exclusive, but we need to rephrase the debate so that the investments up front are made so we can realize that better environment on the tail end. We have some incredible technologies that can integrate gray and green infrastructures and blue infrastructures. But the thing is, we have to make a value statement, and people need to demand or accept the investment in that more intensive design in order to have the outcome that they want 30 years down the road. And quite often, we don't see that vision politically. And we don't see that vision empirically in land development business relations. But if the marketplace demands, they'll figure out how to make it profitable for themselves. But we do have the technology. Development and environmental suitability are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they do cost a little more. As we talk about building housing units for underserved and dispossessed, as we talk about where are we settling people because of sea level rise, those are large land planning questions about where you put. But where we have the technology is how you put. And I'm imagining that wherever we're putting people, we're putting them close enough to water so they can drink.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from Stanhope, New Jersey. So I'm from Stanhope, New Jersey.
Yeah.
It's close to Netcong, Mount Olive area. And I know Netcong, they just put in 2 different apartment complexes. One of them they built literally like, you know, it's on a slope, they're uphill, and they're probably about 20 feet away from the water. Like literally on top of the freaking stream. I'm sorry, I'm like really annoyed about it.
Okay.
So there's that, and now Mount Olive is looking at putting in like over 600 units in Mount Olive. And again, it's close to the Musconetcong River, and it's near our water supplies. And going off of what he was saying, we have a lot of towns that are forced to do, build affordable housing. There's these COA policies. We need to build more houses. Like our town is being forced to meet COA regulations to build more, and we really don't even have the room to build. We have bear issues, the wildlife corridor, and so what I don't understand is like how there isn't any kind of like regulation that prevents developers from developing like in our areas that are going to be wetland. There's no buffer. There's nothing to absorb water runoff, and I don't understand how, with all of this knowledge that we have, that we can't be smarter to make sure we have clean water for future generations.
Well, I think that most people are picking up what you're putting down in the room here. I'm not sure that I have an answer for you, but I would suggest that there are levers that can be pushed. And I am not up to date on this, but I've been hearing in the past week and a half, maybe 2 weeks, that the stormwater regulations are changing and towns have about a year or so to make changes. And one of the things in stormwater planning and regulation is the management of trees in riparian areas and what are your plans. So I think we might want to look at the stormwater code as one of those levers that can be brought to bear to, you're not going to stop development unless something really major happens. And I don't know what that is. That's not my thing. But I would I'd want to know what my stormwater engineering plan is. And if they're looking at woodland management as part of the solution to stormwater, I'd want to know that pretty soon. I have yet to read it, but I'm hearing a lot about it, and I think it's something we all ought to look at and check into.
We're kind of getting close on time, but did anybody else have a question before I go ahead?
Yeah, old growth forests, there really aren't any in the Northeast. How do we really know what happens in them? We can't go back to the 1700s or 1600s and do a study. We don't have any really good large area to say really what happens and to do research. How do we project we can't use the West Coast, we can't use someplace in Canada or whatever. So how do we know what's really going to happen and what is happening in old growth forests?
Well, most foresters I know are frustrated historians that keep pretty good notebooks. Simply because, you know, our management perspective usually transcends 2 to 3 professional careers. So we tend to be rather fastidious in record keeping. So I think there are things that we can learn, and we have learned. We could do better in not forgetting what we've learned. So there's that. But we do have small pockets and stands of things that could be determined as old growth. But one of our biggest obstacles right now is in the definition of old growth, because is old growth something that you're defining by an age of tree? Is old growth about the age of the landform without active management? You know, 2 days after a large forest fire, you could have an old growth forest with only seedlings. Well, 2 years after a fire, I should say. So how we define old growth is certainly our first challenge. We do have pockets of old trees where we can learn and watch. And we have, I was going through one in New Hampshire, outside of Conway, New Hampshire, not that, maybe a year ago. I've got some pockets in central New York that I visit on a regular basis. A good example of how it goes wrong, Hutchinson Memorial Forest that was considered old growth. They did a do not touch because it can't, whenever we manage, it's going to be bad. And we ended up seeing Hutchinson in the 1990s as an example of poor forest management, because in keeping that area supposedly pristine, everything else around it changed, and all of the deer moved into the one area where they were not getting shot, and just blew out the regeneration. And it doesn't work setting things off like that. So with old growth, I think that we do have examples. We have things we can learn, and we can triangulate using our records, because we were keeping records back in the early days. You know, we have some really good accounts from the 1880s about what happened. We have good accounts in the records from the 1750s. We have good accounts from the first European settlers coming down and describing what they were seeing. I think we've got enough information. I think what we have to do is come up with common terms and a common vision, and we can move much more efficiently.
New York State has forest preserve land, which you cannot touch a tree.
Yes.
The study's been done, and there some of those go back quite a while, but
yes. Yeah, I mean, we're not going to have something that's perfect. I remember somebody telling me that we couldn't do anything in the Pinelands because it was a unique ecosystem when it came to managing our power lines. And then you know, some overweight, balding Polish guy stood up and said, you know, on the northern end of the aquifer, they have the same kind of sand and they're managing our OWs. And the zip code changed, but the system had not. And they said, well, it has to be in the zip code. You know, that's a problem when our political boundaries get in the way of our ecological boundaries. And we're still fighting that in places. I think we have enough understanding of how these systems work, and we have enough record keeping that if we can agree on how to attack the problem, we might not get it right, but we're going to be able to target a shotgun and get a good shot pattern. It won't be a rifle shot, but we'll get close enough, and we will learn as it's going to get it better and better. That's how we flew to the moon. That's how we manage forests. That's how we developed the transistor. You get it close and you keep improving it, and you keep improving your speeds, you keep improving your technology, you keep improving your understanding. You improve your understanding by organized observations and writing things down so people can learn from what you've seen. They call it science. We've been doing it a long time. We just have to read older books.
Jason, I know that we're a little bit beyond, but I wanted to take one more question.
Sure.
And my question is very similar, and you probably answered most of it. There's a big debate about pro-forestation these days, and I don't know how people are going to come on figuring it out. But being Rutgers, I figured the college could be doing some kind of studies of, this is where we did the management and this is where we didn't, and these are.
Well, yeah, that data exists in some ways, like I said.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Rutgers belonged to a group that started being pro-forestation. The Rutgers unions withdrew from the organization because we do not see it as a solution. Pro-forestation is not a solution. It's a strategy, and it's one tool in your toolbox. And we've been using that since Gifford Pinchot talked about protection forests in our first written iteration of forestry in New Jersey. What's changed since Gifford Pinchot's time is what are the values? We've moved from extraction to services, but we haven't changed our strategies as far as how to do things. Proforestation is a rational strategy that can be deployed in some situations, but just like you cannot use a hammer to arc weld, you can't use proforestation as a strategy for a young succession habitat if you've got a rare and endangered species of value. It doesn't work that way. We have multiple strategies to deal with multiple situations. There's nothing wrong with proforestation as a strategy. There is something wrong in putting all of our portfolio into one thing when we don't have the data to say that it's rational. And so I'm not against proforestation as a concept. I am against it as a policy.
Maybe Rutgers could do some more studies, some long-term studies of sites or something.
Well, you could, but we do have the Hutchinson Memorial Forest has a 40-year successional old growth study. And we've watched things disintegrate due to deer. Okay. The data's out there. It's a viable strategy. It is not a solution. I don't think we need more study. We need to change a political debate. And long-term studies are great. I encourage them, but the problem is going to be solved politically in the next 2 years. A long-term study is going to take 50 to 150 years. We don't have that time. We have to trade space for time here. We have that data. It's just that folks are always free to say, well, that's different. Well, of course it's different. But that's how all science works. If I look at a medical study, well, that person wasn't me and I'm unique. That doesn't mean I don't get the shot. Yeah, of course I'm unique, but I look at the preponderance of the evidence. It's not always empirical deductive reasoning. We use inductive reasoning techniques. We use abductive reasoning techniques to go from the unknowns and give it our best shot, because we look at preponderance of evidences. And then we look at, okay, where do we have the empirical data to support those approaches? But I'm not sure that we can study our way out of a political debate where people are maybe not fully understanding the terms they're using or the consequences of adoption of those terms. And I think that's the big thing.
Or maybe, like you said, they're seeing one piece of the puzzle and there's other pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly.
So it's like all different.
Yeah. Hey, if it was easy, I'd have hair. You know, this comes from banging the head on the wall. Okay.
One quick other follow-up question. Do you know anybody in Rutgers who's studying the deer problem, trying to come up with a policy to deal with it, whether it's market hunting or something? Anybody at Rutgers studying that and providing guidance for the state?
Yes, yes. His name is Joe Paulin. And we're actually about to release a video looking at the agricultural consequences of deer control, about how it's affecting our food supply in New Jersey. Joe will be defending his PhD, if I have any say in it, in 4 weeks. Yeah, we've got people working on it. You know, if you go to Rutgers Cooperative Extension, Joseph Paulin, Paulin, actually, he gave a talk for backyard forestry in 90 minutes. His whole dissertation is human relationships with deer, with bear, with geese, and how that information can be used to develop rational policy. That's his whole thing in human ecology. So we've got somebody working on it. It's closing up as far as the data. Then it's the rollout as far as outreach. And, you know, I think Rutgers has yet to hire that correct outreach person yet. Joe's filling the role as a grad student, but I'm not sure as if, you know, we got to see if the university can invest in him as a professional post-graduation.
So he's coming up with policy issues and recommendations how to do, or just defining the problem?
Well, what he's doing is he's looking at historic data, and he's looking at where are those tipping points where people start being able to talk about lethal versus non-lethal controls. With deer, we're talking about the tipping points in the economic argument as far as people abandoning farming because the deer eat over 50% of the crop. You know, we're talking about bear and the sense of safety in communities and how that's a function of population density of bears and population density of people.
Yeah, well, deer are destroying the forest.
Well, they're destroying the forest. They're destroying the agricultural belt too. No doubt. And that's it. I still say that venison is quite tasty, and we need food science. We need food science to come up with a new chicken McNugget called the venison Viggiers.
All right, Jason, I don't mean to cut you off, but
no. I understand. You got a program, folks. I'm easy to find. Thank you for showing up.
Thanks for your time. I appreciate it. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you guys off, but I'm going to give you 5 minutes for a break. We actually had 15 minutes built into the schedule, but kind of short on time now to keep on schedule. You know, we'll get 5 minutes. So,
hey, Jason, do you want to stay with us, or do you want me to end?
We'll end in a second. I just want to make the bold statement: never ask an academic to be cogent.
Oh, Jason, name and phone number.
Okay, my name is Jason Grabosky. I think it's on the bottom of the screen. Do you see that?
Yep.
Yeah, I got that.
Okay, and it's my last name at SEBS.
Probably not.
Here, I tell you what, give me just a second here.
Put it up.
Yeah. Here's my email.
There it is. And Jason, we recorded this presentation, so with your permission, I will share it with the stewards.
Okay, that's
Okay.
fine. Hopefully I was clear in proforestation. I was trying out a new set of slides. I hope it came out okay.
I think it did. I think
Okay.
it did. Thank you, Jason.
No
All right.
problem.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
I'll give it my best shot. Take care.
Okay, great. Talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.